I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
Army Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Jack Canon, freshly back from his time abroad as a so-called roving intelligence officer, had only been in his new role as Provost General, otherwise known as the Military Police Chief, at Fort Hood Military Base in Texas for a few short months before he was dragged before a military tribunal for a court-martial in December of 1958. He was even briefly hospitalized for treatment of a so-called mental disorder, in relation to the then still unpublicized incident. This is according to the October 13, 1958 edition of the Bryan-College Station Eagle newspaper, a local paper in Texas. By December, Canon was found innocent in the bizarre case brought before him. The local papers were outraged that an apparently decent army officer was being dragged for what appeared as such ridiculous accusations. Some papers, such as the Paris, Texas News, on Christmas Eve of 1958, noted that he had been apprehended for, quote, withholding information about the theft of ammunition, end quote, and an assortment of other used or damaged military gear, such as old helmets. Another report, in the Times Record News of Wichita Falls, Texas, claimed that the 43-year-old Army intelligence officer was being charged for shooting 2 cows in a nearby field. The military tribunal ultimately found Canon innocent on all counts, despite him facing some 43 charges of theft of military gear, ammunition, and the shooting of livestock on base. Then, by January 14th of 1959, some 2 weeks after Castro had taken control of Havana, Colonel Jack Canon, who was just under investigation for stealing military property, was given a new assignment at Fort Hood, Texas, as executive officer for the 2nd Ordnance Group, a role where he conceivably was given access to far more sophisticated military hardware than in his previous role as the Provost General. Even the Waco Times-Herald made note of this strange promotion, claiming, quote, most Army observers felt the colonel would be transferred from Fort Hood after the court-martial because of the publicity it caused and of the allegations made during the testimony, end quote. I want to ask here, why would an Army officer who was just accused of stealing military hardware be elevated to heading an ordnance group, in other words, a group dealing specifically with the storage and oversight of military equipment? As I will suggest and argue moving forward, Roving Intelligence Officer Canon was seemingly, at least based on my research, beginning his new mission, which was to smuggle surplus U.S. Army gear to Cuba, both in support of the Revolutionary Army first, and later in support of the anti-Castro underground. 1959 would mark the beginning of Jack Canon and Fort Hood more broadly as vectors of weapons to the Cuban underground. Although the Cuban Revolution and fighting was largely over by January 1st of 1959, the demand for arms in Cuba kept steady, especially as the island became something akin to a soldier of fortune Woodstock in the wake of Castro's victory. From across the United States, opportunistic mercenaries and wannabe paramilitary types, by any means necessary, found passage to Cuba, where the roaring success of the low-intensity guerrilla warfare campaign waged against the Batista regime provided a significant dose of optimism for future campaigns of that same sort. Ambitious eyes in Havana quickly turned to the neighboring island of Hispaniola, split between the Dominican Republic, under the vastly unpopular Rafael Trujillo, and the country of Haiti, ruled by the soon-to-be equally unpopular regime of François Duvalier. Here, an interesting convergence of interests began to materialize between some supposedly unlikely allies. For a short period after the fighting had ended in Cuba, there were indications that the communist members of Castro's close entourage, but most notably Che Guevara, saw the victory in Cuba as an opportunity to extend the revolution across the Caribbean and Central America, overthrowing the tin pot US-backed dictators and creating a new bloc. At least that's what Frank Sturgis apparently told American legal attaché and, little did he know, undercover FBI asset James Haverty in Havana shortly after the revolution, according to the book Warrior. As it is said in the book, quote, he told them, here being Haverty, there were known communists in the Cuban army, like Che Guevara, who were plotting to overthrow governments in the Dominican Republic, Panama, and Nicaragua." End quote. Additionally, it appeared that, according to the FBI files on the towering soldier of fortune Gerry Patrick Hemming, himself also in Havana, who joined Sturgis in Cuba sometime in February of 1959, that Nicaragua was the clear target. The file states that by April of 1960, so 1 year later, he, quote, was then employed by the Cuban Revolutionary Air Force at San Julian as a parachutist and was then engaged in training Nicaraguans, end quote. We can see here that the Nicaraguan invasion plans remained operational throughout the first 2 years of the revolutionary government, bolstered by the soldiers of fortune that shoveled their way into the island. As mentioned in his FBI file, Hemming apparently served in a somewhat official capacity in the Cuban Revolutionary military, specifically in the fledgling and inexperienced Air Force. This specific area was arguably where Castro needed foreign support the most, as the island lacked the expertise to train pilots and the material necessary to service planes. This was especially the case as Batista's Air Force personnel were either purged or escaped to South Florida. The Cuban Air Force was one of the few disparate areas that would fall under the purview of the revolutionary Yankee himself, Frank Sturgis. As an American who had actually fought during the Cuban Revolution alongside Castro, and was not simply a bandwagoner like the other mercenary types floating around, Sturgis had a certain level of status above the paramilitary riffraff that was flooding Havana in 1959. Castro clearly respected and trusted Sturgis, in retrospect, a bit too much given his unclear political credentials and his ongoing relationship with US intelligence. Sturgis, who had been conferred the rank of captain in Castro's military, was given two prominent roles in the revolutionary government. First, as the director of security for the Cuban Air Force. In this capacity, Sturgis met Gerry Patrick Hemming, himself serving as a paratrooper serving at the air base at Pinar del Rio. This linkage between Sturgis and Hemming would last throughout the secret war against Castro, as Frank would come to be one of the major sponsors, or at least the popular front for sponsors, of Hemming's mercenary band known as the International Penetration Force, otherwise known more commonly as Interpen, and also often called the No-Name Key Group, especially in official memos and reports. Now, much more on No-Name Key later. As Interpen was not founded until 1961 in Florida as the supposed paratrooper unit of Frank Sturgis's anti-Castro organization known as the Anti-Communist International Brigade. Yet we can trace the origins of the Interpen squad back to revolutionary Cuba, where Hemming met his future sponsor, Frank Sturgis, as well as some of his other future recruits amongst the disparate soldier of fortune types also working in Castro's Air Force. Not everyone who was entering Cuba in 1959 had the same luster as the swashbuckling Sturgis or the towering Hemming. The pool of men that Hemming recruited from left much to be desired. There was no better example of the caliber, or lack thereof, of available men to fill out the Interpen roster than Loran Eugene Hall. Hall is not immediately important to our story today, but he will return closer to the assassination. He has even figured in many theories as one of the gunmen in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Suspiciously, one of the major figures to point towards Hall as a top suspect for the JFK assassination was his former boss at the mercenary outfit Interpen, Gerry Patrick Hemming, who told Senate investigators that in 1963 he believed that Lorenzo Hall, which is Loran Hall's alias, was somehow involved in the JFK assassination. As he told journalist and author Dick Russell later in a 1993 interview in Argosy magazine, wherein he even confirms that Hall was in Dallas on the day, at least according to him. Quote, "Yes, the day of the assassination I made a call to Texas from Miami, and I pointedly asked, is Lorenzo Hall in Dallas? I made the call about 1:30 or 2 in the afternoon. He was there. My contact had seen him in Dallas." End quote. Later in the interview, he even suggests that Hall might have taken his Johnson 30-06 breakdown rifle with scope to do the deed. Now you may be starting to understand why Gerry Patrick Hemming and this whole Interpen network remains problematic to JFK researchers. They were all willing to point the finger at their own and blab about their own involvement. This willingness to go on the record and tell all continues to fuel my speculation that Gerry Hemming's outfit were in place as both distractions and what you could come to call additional patsies. And as we will see, with Loran Eugene Hall's strange activities as a drifter and mercenary, especially in the months leading up to the JFK hit, Interpen activities were always coated in a strange sense of artifice and theater. Despite being a marginal figure in 1959, I hope to focus on Hall specifically today because I believe he is a prime example of the riffraff nature of the opportunistic paramilitary types that were buzzing around Cuba and who would come to fill out Interpen's roster. By almost all accounts, Loran Hall was a dirtbag and a drifter. The nice thing about writing about these Interpen guys is that they all have fleshed out FBI files, from their consistent run-ins with the law and their relatively low status on the paramilitary totem pole. These were, after all, forward-facing elements of this paramilitary milieu. It is from the multiple FBI reports on Loran Hall that I will be pulling the following information. It's up to you to decide whether the FBI breadcrumb trail was intentional to lead researchers off track or genuinely represented an interest in these subjects. Born in Newton, Kansas in 1930, according to his various FBI files, Hall drifted from job to job aimlessly for most of his young adulthood. Most interesting of his various odd jobs was a short stint where he worked at a Boeing plant manufacturing aircraft. This apparently came to an end after he fell off a plane and injured himself, and quickly found himself out of a job. This would be a usual occurrence throughout his biography. Hall claimed to have served some time in the Marines, often seen as a rite of passage for these mercenary circles. But of course, as it would have it, there are no records of such service. Instead, he served as a weapons specialist in the Army from 1947 to 52, serving for some time in Germany. Apparently out of a desire to join the revolutionary forces in Cuba, in March of 1959, Loran Hall left his sleepy Kansas town, which funnily his FBI report notes that he lived at with his parents, to find a new purpose on the Caribbean island. Much of this information comes from a 1959 FBI interview of Loran Hall's father, Jack Hall. This interview was retrieved by the FBI later in 1964 after Loran Hall and his fellow Interpen mercenary, Lawrence Howard's names arose during the Warren Commission, the official investigation of the JFK assassination. Hall and Lawrence's names were raised in connection to a strange September 1963 house visit they were suspected of apparently making to see the daughter of a Cuban exile leader named Sylvia Odio at her Dallas apartment. Sylvia's testimony to the Warren Commission did not name the two by name, instead specifically identifying three men. Two unknown dark-complexioned men who spoke broken English, accompanied by one fluent English-speaking white man. The story gets increasingly bizarre, as later, after their visit, Sylvia Odio received a call from a man alleging to be the white English speaker amongst the trio. According to Sylvia, the man on the phone made sure to emphasize that his name was Leon. Later, further corroborating the story, Sylvia Odio's sister, who was also present during this strange visit, would confirm that the white man introduced himself as Leon Oswald at her sister's front door that September night in 1963. It would be after the assassination, when Lee Harvey Oswald's face was plastered on every TV set and newspaper, that Sylvia Odio realized that the mysterious Leon she had met that night was in fact the man suspected of killing Kennedy a couple of months later. Now, as I previously mentioned, Loran Eugene Hall, our Kansas drifter, enters the picture during the Warren Commission when he is mistakenly identified as one of the three men from Sylvia Odio's apartment. As I'm sure you can all imagine, the Warren Commission struggled to make this incident fit into the lone nut narrative that they were trying to form. And conspicuously, our man Loran Hall eventually admitted himself, and then later retracted, that the aforementioned Leon Oswald was actually another Interpen member named William Seymour, a close associate of Hall's, with the two being arrested together several times in the months preceding the assassination. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. I promise I want to return to the Odio story and do it justice, because this is just scratching the surface. But it remains one of the key pieces of evidence breaking the lone nut narrative surrounding Oswald. But before moving on, I do want to say, in regards to the FBI's interview of Loran Hall's father, it is interesting to see here that the FBI was conducting interviews of family members of people who left for Cuba all the way back in 1959. As we know, the FBI was actively debriefing Americans on the island, as I noted earlier with FBI asset James Haverty's discussion with Frank Sturgis. It did appear, and as I will continue to show, Havana in 1959 and 1960 was a real mecca for intelligence asset recruitment, with the CIA, FBI, and Army intelligence all having a significant presence on the island, as I will continue to show. Loran Hall could have been scouted by the FBI, hence the interview of his father. Adding to this FBI angle is the Bureau's own role in influencing, or one could even say guiding, the Warren Commission's investigation into the so-called Odio incident. Author and researcher Larry Hancock notes in his book Someone Would Have Talked that the evidence linking Loran Hall, Lawrence Howard, and William Seymour to the Odio House incident in the Warren Commission was provided by the FBI after Sylvia's inconvenient testimony to the commission. It was apparently a somewhat dubious FBI report that placed those three men at the doorstep that night, despite none of them having any recollection of being there, and all eventually coming to deny their involvement. But Loran Hall, in contrast to his two comrades, did initially come up with a partial confession, noting William Seymour as the Leon Oswald character that I mentioned earlier. Maybe he was clued into some sort of fall guy operation, to allow the Warren Commission to move on from this difficult episode. Or maybe this was just his training at Interpen. Take the blame and move on. The FBI's continued interest in Hall from 1959 onwards, and his short cooperation with their narrative later, could indicate some deeper relationship between the Bureau and the Drifter. Many figures in this nexus were feeding information to the FBI on the side. Even potentially Lee Harvey Oswald himself, as we will come to see. However, maybe another explanation for the interview could have been in connection with Loran Hall's arrest and detention in Cuba by Cuban police very shortly after arriving. According to the record, not even a month after landing in Havana, Hall was arrested for, quote, not getting along with Captain Salazar, his superior in the Cuban army. He had joined up with Fidel's men, including Hemming and Sturgis, who were planning for the future invasion of Nicaragua. Further adding to this, Hall stated that he, quote, thought he was working for Dr. Fidel Castro, end quote, when he originally shipped off for Cuba, fully exposing his delusion of grandeur. Turning back to the FBI's 1959 interview of Loran's father, Jack Hall, where he stated that he, quote, has no idea as to why Loran went to Cuba, end quote, and that his son did not even own a car in Kansas. He claimed that in leaving for Cuba, Loran Hall, forever the deadbeat, abandoned his separated wife and 4 children back in Kansas to fend for their own. In summary, if anyone is indicative of the quality of men rushing to Cuba in the wake of the revolution, the broke, insubordinate, deadbeat dad Loran Eugene Hall is something of a perfect example of the bottom end of the recruit pool. We often focus on the types of Gerry Patrick Hemming and Frank Sturgis, but we have to remember that there is a serious range here. Yet for all his shortcomings, Loran Hall did land at the right place at the right time, ending up in the company, at least for a short period, of Cuban Air Force Security Chief and future Interpen sponsor Frank Sturgis. Hall's own FBI file outlines this meetup, stating, quote, he, Hall here, then met Captain Frank Fiorini, I'll remind you who was Frank Sturgis' name before, an American with the Revolutionary Air Force. He also met 2 other Americans with the Revolutionary Forces, Lieutenant Jack Sheay and Captain Rex Sunderland, end quote. Now I've looked for records on Captain Rex Sunderland, and he's honestly a complete blank. Hall's FBI file appears to be the only place that he is named, at least according to the Mary Farrell Foundation archives, which are usually quite thorough. However, I want to zero in on the other name here, a so-called lieutenant in Castro's military, known as Jack Sheay. This name appears inconspicuous, but upon further research it becomes clearer as to who Jack Sheay was in reality. Let's jump forward to 1978. Gerry Patrick Hemming was pulled before the House Select Committee on Assassinations for testimony. In that lengthy interview, which totals over 200 pages typed out, Gerry Hemming was asked if he could identify any Americans that were working alongside the Cuban revolutionary turned commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Camilo Cienfuegos. Besides Fidel and Che, Cienfuegos was arguably the 3rd most recognizable face of the Cuban Revolution. Known for his warm smile and connection to the rural poor, Cienfuegos was something akin to a folk hero, representing the interests of the peasants while not adhering to strict communist principles, in contrast to Che and increasingly Fidel. Cienfuegos would disappear in October of 1959 when his plane went missing. The circumstances remain unclear to this day, with some speculating that he had been disappeared by Fidel's brother Raul Castro, who feared that Cienfuegos' personal magnetism threatened his brother's hold on power. To this day, Cienfuegos is still celebrated in Cuba as a martyr for the revolution, despite the ongoing speculation of foul play. For now, though, I am less interested in Cienfuegos and more interested in the Americans that Gerry Hemming identified as working with him. And in 1978, Hemming noted that quite a few Americans were working alongside the smiling revolutionary. These included Mitchell Devereux, Paul Hughes, and most notably, a man named Jack Sheay, whom he emphasizes was actually a man named Jack Canon, written here with 2 N's. Now we can go 2 ways with this. Either we discard this 2N Canon as a completely different person from our Army intelligence officer Canon with 1 N. If that is the case, I would still argue, as you will see, that Jack Sheay, aka Canon, is worth documenting, as he was a key and often overlooked player in these Cuban paramilitary circles, and would work as a major weapons smuggler for Hemming, Sturgis, and their associates into the early 60s. However, allow me to argue the case that these 2 Jack Canons, this Jack Sheay alias and the one at Fort Hood, were conceivably the same recently court-martialed roving Army intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Y. Canon, with 1 N. Although there is unfortunately no smoking gun proof indicating that the 2 Jack Canons were the same man, I do genuinely believe, after digging up what I think is every bit of publicly available information about Jack Canon, that they were in fact both the same person. So, if you are skeptical, I understand, but entertain me here and see what I mean. Firstly, I will remind you that Peter Dale Scott in his book Deep Politics and the Death of JFK did assert that Colonel Jack Canon had, quote, penetrated Castro's guerrilla operations, end quote, which would indicate that this Jack Sheay could have very likely simply been a cover name for the aforementioned intelligence officer, as Gerry Hemming said Jack Sheay is actually Jack Canon. Circumstantially, as we will see, the reports on Jack Sheay, aka Jack Canon's behavior in Cuba, do line up with the personal character of gun-toning Colonel Cactus Jack at Fort Hood, Texas. I will also speculate here that the differences in spelling of Jack's last name, with either 1 N or 2, may have served an intrinsic intelligence purpose, as a signifier of sorts. If one referred to Jack Canon with 1 N in, say, a memo or a newspaper article, the relevant authorities could trace this back to Army intelligence or higher echelon officials who had the knowledge of his name spelled properly with 1 N. Or, otherwise, this was the Jack Canon serving in his true sense as an intelligence officer. But Jack Canon with 2 N's could have conceivably been the name he was giving out to Gerry Hemming and the riffraff in Cuba. We could call this a fake real name, the name associated with his undercover work as apparently an American soldier of fortune serving in Cuba. Consequently, if the 2N Canon appeared in reports, his handlers could trace this to his undercover work. And finally, his cover name was apparently Jack Sheay, the name he presumably used on the streets of Havana. Now, I want to note here this is all purely speculation on my part. It is interesting to note, though, that after his court-martial and subsequent assignment to an ordnance group at Fort Hood in January 1959, the Jack Canon with 1 N disappears from the public record, and Jack Canon with 2 N's, under the supposed alias of Jack Sheay, emerges in Cuba alongside Loran Eugene Hall and Frank Sturgis. Since Hall had arrived in Cuba in March of 1959 and would be imprisoned by April, this leaves a short window in early 1959 when Jack Sheay, aka Canon, could have first arrived in Cuba, presumably between February and April, only a mere month or 2 after his court-martial. And I will remind you that associated with that court-martial, Canon had been reassigned as the head of an ordnance group at Fort Hood, Texas, putting him in charge of large stores of weapons and ammunition. Could Cactus Jack, as he was known, have been working as the main weapon supplier to Frank Sturgis and his motley crew of invaders to Nicaragua? I will remind you that Peter Dale Scott noted that Castro tolerated many of these Yankee interlopers because of their ability to procure U.S. Army surplus gear. Jack Canon, aka Jack Sheay, therefore was in effect in a perfect position to facilitate the smuggling of said weapons, firstly to Sturgis's forces, ostensibly in support of the Air Force, and the planned invasion of Nicaragua, and then later to the various Cuban underground groups, supplying a stay-behind network of anti-Castro opposition groups on the island, once the US turned fully against Castro's government. Now, following the Jack Sheay lead, Canon's supposed alias while in Cuba, we get indications from newspaper reports and a 1977 interview conducted by the House Select Committee on Assassinations that he was acting undercover in Cuba as a so-called tourist police officer. Now, the tourist police were a cadre of English-speaking constables that were brought in by the previous Batista government to ensure the security of tourists and to provide various services to visitors to Cuba. These tourist police officers are something of a forgotten relic of these times, but they are described in John Andrew Gustafson's 2009 PhD dissertation at the University of Miami, titled Tension Under the Sun, Tourism and Identity in Cuba, 1945 to 2007. In his dissertation, Gustafson describes the tourist police, which he calls a, quote, specialty of Havana, as, quote, specially trained officers who wore white armbands marked tourist squad, spoke and wrote English, and could be found near the capital's major intersections and most important tourist sites. End quote. We will get to it soon, but Batista's Cuba was fully geared towards American tourists, so the existence of so-called tourist police forces is unsurprising. What should be noted here is how a tourist police officer role would have served as brilliant cover for an undercover English-speaking intelligence asset in the Caribbean island. Perfect for a Texan gunslinger like Jack Canon, who would be hobnobbing with both American visitors in Havana and the English-speaking soldier of fortune types that were increasingly finding roles in Castro's early military. Now, serving undercover as a tourist police officer provided perfect cover for an asset such as Jack Canon, who would be wandering around the island presumably meeting with future members and sponsors of the anti-Castro underground. By tracking Cactus Jack's time as a tourist police, we get some funny stories. One such story, published in the Miami Herald on March 26, 1959, alleges that Cuban tourist police Jack Sheay crashed a party being hosted by Hollywood actor Errol Flynn in Havana. According to the Herald, quote, the Cuban official, in a drunk and disorderly condition and flourishing 2 guns, burst into the actor's apartment at the Comodoro Hotel on March 11th, while the actor was giving a party. End quote. This story attributes Jack Sheay to Brooklyn, which either solidifies that this is a different person than Texas Jack Canon, or was simply Jack Sheay's cover story. I do think that besides the Brooklyn connection, this story otherwise serves to solidify that the drunken tourist police officer was indeed our Jack Canon. Before I get into it, I want to note here that the name Jack Sheay may have been selected on purpose to help Canon infiltrate high society circles in Havana. As it turns out, Jack Sheay was also the name of a budding TV director at the time, who around the same time was contributing to the Jerry Lewis Show and Bob Hope's TV specials. The director Jack Sheay was himself from New York City, which could explain why he was attributed to Brooklyn in the Miami Herald. Additionally, using the Jack Sheay name could have helped Canon get access to VIP events, posing as the director Sheay to get on the guest list of exclusive parties, such as that of Errol Flynn from the Miami Herald article. From an unusual yet telling source, we get insight into Jack Canon's debaucherous and unorthodox hotshot style, which further corroborates Jack Sheay's reported gun-toting behavior at the Comodoro Hotel party all the way later in 1959. Japanese actress and suspected intelligence asset Yoshiko Yamaguchi mentioned Colonel Jack Canon by name in her memoirs, recalling her interactions with Canon and his so-called Z unit in Japan in the immediate post-war years. This was while Canon was serving under Army Intelligence General Charles Willoughby in the Far East. Her memoirs give us a unique perspective on Canon the man and his persona as a heavy-drinking gunslinger. As she puts it, quote, he struck me as a boorish military man, with less than cultivated manners. One time, saying that he would take us for a drive around the suburbs of Kamakura, he had me sitting next to him while his subordinates took the back seats. Holding a pistol while driving, he would fire at the birds or squirrels when they came into sight, and when there was a hit, he would grin in a manner reminiscent of James Cagney in a gangster movie. I thought I was going to die, as he drove with such recklessness, braking his car frequently and hard along the way." End quote. Later, Yamaguchi shares a story that sounds almost identical to Canon's or Jack Sheay's run-in with Errol Flynn in Cuba some 15 years later. She claimed in her memoir, quote, "I attended just one such party on the invitation of the young officers and former visitors of Kamakura. Once I knew it was Canon's party, I quickly left earlier. I was sickened when I was confronted with the sight of a drunken Canon flinging a cat against the wall." End quote. Does this not almost perfectly mirror drunken Jack Sheay threatening the movie star at his Havana party? Now, taking this a step further, understanding Errol Flynn's activities in Cuba at the time also helps to explain why Jack Sheay, or as I'm suggesting Canon, according to the Miami Herald article, seemingly at random, threatened the movie star with 245s. Flynn at the time was one of, if not the most significant American celebrity who was vocally supportive of Fidel Castro's revolution. Flynn found himself in Cuba originally to produce his penultimate film, Cuban Rebel Girls, which eventually turned into a pro-Castro semi-documentary where Flynn played himself as a journalist covering the Cuban Revolution. This is a complex story. It was originally made under the Batista regime. It was changed to fit the new Castro revolution. Anyways, it's a bit of a mess, but importantly, Castro was apparently thrilled with Flynn's positive portrayals of his movement and kept the actor around to film what would be the actor's final film, called Cuban Story: The Truth About Fidel Castro's Revolution, which was a documentary narrated by Flynn again that was unapologetically pro-Castro. This feature was eventually released alongside Cuban Rebel Girls by the end of 1959. So was tourist police officer Jack Sheay coming by Errol Flynn's party to coerce the actor to cut off all this pro-Castro nonsense? Importantly, Jack Sheay, aka Canon, did not appear at the proceedings following Flynn's charges. When asked why he didn't push back against the drunk gun-toting cop, Flynn told the Miami Herald, quote, "I never argue with a .45, particularly when it's in the hands of a drunk." End quote. The incident was left at that, as it appeared to fall out of the news cycle quite quickly. Jack Sheay would not be named in newspapers again from my research, and Errol Flynn would be dead in Vancouver by the end of the year. It doesn't seem like his death was the result of any foul play, as the biopsy showed his body was in terrible shape, with a blood clot in an artery and cirrhosis of the liver from excessive drinking. Funnily enough, Frank Sturgis also met Errol Flynn while in Cuba, apparently his favorite actor. According to the book Warrior, he was eventually disappointed to find his favorite one-time action star as a drunken mess. But refocusing here, we can see how Jack Canon operated: gun-toting and wild. This was a trend throughout his career, tracing back to his time in Japan. Today I gave a sneak peek at his activities there, as I hope to look back at that period later in upcoming episodes about his former boss and mentor, General Charles Willoughby, as I feel like Jack Canon's work in Japan right after the war kind of serves as the final piece of the puzzle to explain his somewhat mysterious and obscure work in Cuba much later. So we will wrap back around to that later and it will all make sense. Jack Canon's supposed escapades in post-revolutionary Havana, undercover posing as a tourist police officer, brings our focus back to the Cuban capital, at the time a swirling nexus of intrigue and intelligence activity. By early 1959, the Cuban CIA station was loaded with top covert operations men and spies ready to head out into Havana and scout out recruits for what would become first the Bay of Pigs invasion and later Operation Mongoose under Kennedy. By 1959, archetypal CIA spy David Atlee Phillips was fresh back from his time in Lebanon, posted at his old desk in Havana. The situation in Cuba had changed considerably since he was last there for 2 years from 1956 to 57 during the tumultuous Batista years. Castro's troops marched on Havana on New Year's Day 1959, and since then the country was in limbo. It remained unclear whether Castro was willing to play ball with the US business interests that owned most of Cuba's natural resources. This was the same for the American National Crime Syndicate, which owned most of the island's tourism industry, which had been steadily growing since the 1930s. Alongside David Phillips were other CIA luminaries: David Morales, a former colleague from the Guatemalan coup, otherwise known as PB Success, and a renowned assassination expert. This was the same Morales who would train the CIA-funded Operation 40 hit squad for the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the same David Morales who would follow future Miami Station Chief Ted Shackley for the rest of his career. Firstly to Southeast Asia in the mid-60s, and then later back to the Western Hemisphere for his last years at CIA. From their vantage point in the CIA base and the US Embassy, Castro's government seemed to be firmly in place with broad popular support from the masses. I will turn towards the testimony of another PB Success veteran, the everywhere man E. Howard Hunt, very much unequal to his colleague David Phillips. In a 1999 interview with the National Security Archives, Hunt indicated that he was ordered to give a brief summary by Langley of the situation on the ground after the revolution. He stated the following, quote, "The main object that I was to consider while there was the strength of Castro's popularity on the street. In short, if there is an opposition invasion of Cuba, will the populace take up arms against Castro, or will they stay loyal to him? I stayed 3 or 4 days in Havana at that time, got out on the street, talked with a lot of people, taxi drivers, naturally, and men and women who ran these small lunch stands down at the waterfront. And all I could detect was a lot of enthusiasm for Fidel Castro." End quote. This popular support became increasingly concerning to the US establishment, especially as Castro began to undertake policies that fell outside of the acceptable purview of a US client, most notably the nationalization of foreign-controlled property. By mid-1959, Fidel turned towards the tourism and gaming industry as next on his nationalization list, a major driver of the Cuban economy and a clear symbol of the excesses of the Batista years. Castro entrusted his Yankee comrade Frank Sturgis with his second task besides his role as the head of security in the Cuban Air Force, and that was as his Minister of Gambling, in charge of firstly collecting taxes from the syndicates that owned the casinos, and later renegotiating the Batista-era agreements with the mob casino owners to either make right with Cuba or get out. This task is what would ultimately turn Sturgis away from Castro and into the Florida paramilitary nexus, where his status would continue to grow. Thank you all for watching as always, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like and a comment and let me know your thoughts down below. First and foremost, I would like to thank all of my supporters on Patreon for making these videos possible. On screen now are my producer tier patrons. The video you just watched was first made available to all of them on April 26, 2025. If you wish to get early access to my content, get access to small Patreon bonus videos, and connect with me on a more personal level, please consider checking out my Patreon page down below, in the description. There you can find all of the upcoming videos this year, and my newest series that is premiering right now, focused on the history of modern Japan. So all that, and more, below. That's all I've got for you today. Until next Friday when I upload Chapter 4 of the Road to Dallas series, which will be focused on Meyer, Lansky, and the gambling syndicates in Cuba. So, until then, thank you all for watching, and remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.